بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, the commentary on Nur al-Idah, we have reached Faslun fi awsaf al-Wudu, the section on the qualities of wudu, meaning the awsaf al-Wudu, meaning it's the rulings that wudu takes. أوصافها من حيث الحكم. Right? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, al-wudu ala thalathati aqsam. Wudu takes one of three rulings. Wudu takes one of three rulings. So he says, وقد in the commentary, rahimahullah ta'ala, قال الإمام الشربلاري رحمه الله تعالى وقد ذكرها بعد بيان سببه وشرطه وحكمه وركنه. He mentions these after mentioning the cause of wudu, the condition of wudu, the ruling of wudu, and its integrals. So now he's mentioning when is wudu, what are the rulings of wudu, meaning when is it required, when is obligatory, when it's wajib, and when it is mustahab. Right? So let's see what he tells us. فقال رحمه الله الوضوء على ثلاثة أقسام. So he said رحمه الله, and of course the one who's saying it is the commentator himself, but he does this as one of the ways that the commentators write is what's called at-tajreed, right? So sort of stepping away, he's talking about himself in the third person. Al-tajreed, because now his role is, I as the commentator am explaining this text, even though the text is his, and also one of the meanings in this is tawadu, is humility, right? Because not repeating, saying, well, and I said this, and I said this. So he puts it in the third person. There's a meaning there of tajreed, and there's a meaning there of tawadu, of humility. Right? So he says, wudu take is of three types. الأول منها أنه فرض. The first of these is that it is obligatory. لما قدمناه بدليله. Of what we have mentioned before with its evidence. Right? That when is wudu required? Yeah. Right? And the primary one is for the prayer, and he'll mention these now with its proof, right? وَالْمُرَادُ بِالْفَرْض هُنَا الثَّابِتُ الْقَطْعِي. And what's meant by the fard here is that which is affirmed decisively, right? Because fard right can sometimes be used to refer to al-fard al-amali, al-fard al-amali, to that which is operationally fard, right? Because so as for that which is fard, meaning that which is decisively fard, because there's also that which is al-fard al-amali, which is something that is established by a text that is open to interpretation or to the possibility of interpretation. But due to surrounding considerations, the mujtahid deemed it to reach the level of being, so it's wajib thubutan, it's wajib thubutan, but because of its evidentiary, because of surrounding considerations and circumstances, the mujtahid deemed it to be effectively like the fard. So there's a category of wajib. There's a regular wajib in the Hanafi school, which is that which is affirmed by ما ثبت بدليل ظني, that which is established by a non-decisive text. But then the higher level of wajib is what's called al-fardul amali, that which is operationally fard. Al-fardul amali يثبت بما يثبت به الواجب. Right? It's affirmed by that which the wajib is affirmed by, but it, due to secondary considerations understood by the mujtahid, it's treated like the fard من حيث العمل. It's treated like the fard in terms of action. That's why they define the fard al-amali as ما يفوت الجواز بفوته. The fard al-amali is that which validity is lifted if vitiated. So here, the author is pointing to a subtlety, right? Yeah, the validity is lifted if it is omitted. He says, أما المحدود والمقدار فهو ما يفوت الجواز بفوته. Right? This is right. أما المحدود والمقدار, because the limits, what? What do you have? And in حاشية تحت, what are you looking at? Okay, good. And it says it in both the والمحدود والمقدر. Okay, المقدر. Yeah, that. أما المحدود, as for the limits, and أما المحدود والمقدر, as for the fard in terms of the limits of it and the extent of it, فهو ما يفوت الجواز بفوته. Then the fard is referring to al-fard al-amali. فهو, this is al-fard al-amali. Al-fard al-amali وهو ما يفوت الجواز بفوته, is that which validity is lifted if omitted. ليشمل الفرض الاجتهادي, to encompass the فرض الاجتهادي, that which is fard out of ijtihad. Why? Because in terms of thubut, in terms of the evidentiary basis, it is established by what the wajib is established by. It is open to interpretation. But the mujtahid, due to related circumstances, related evidentiary considerations, deemed it to be like the fard in its consequences. كربع الرأس, I'd like a quarter of the head. A quarter of the head, the textual basis in of itself would entail that this is wajib. Why? وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ. The ba could mean التبعيض, wipe some of your heads. Or the ba could be زائدة. So it could be partitive, التبعيض, which is the Shafi'is took. وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ أي شيئا من رؤوسكم. Right? Like you said, أكلت, يعني من الكعك أي شيئا منه. This is باء التبعيض. Or the باء could be زائدة, could be extra. أي وامسحوا رؤوسكم. And this is part of the way Imam Malik took it. So wipe your heads, meaning all of it. So to specify that it is for a quarter is ijtihadi in its asl. Right? But then why would we deem that to be required? Due to secondary considerations. Lahat lil mujtahid. For the mujtahid. One is, when you put a limit, even if the limit is established by ijtihad, if we understand, if Imam Abu Hanifa understood that وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ is referring to a quarter of the head, then less than that would not be valid. If you make his ijtihad tarajjaha that this is the least that is valid, even though it's established by ijtihad, necessarily a limit would need to be definitive, defining, and other considerations as well, insofar as, no other textual basis is found for wiping less than that, etc. كَرُبْعِ الرَّأْسِ, like wiping a quarter of the head. Then he says, وَنَزَلَتْ آيَتُهُ بِالْمَدِينَةِ. The verse of Tahara was revealed in Medina. وَقَدْ فُرِضَ أي الوضوء بمكة. But wudu was made obligatory in Mecca. So the extent of wiping was established before the verse came. So that's part of what is part of the fard al-ijtihadi. That, and if you look at the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the least that is established, like the hadith of Mughira bin Shu'bah, is a quarter. Right? Masha nasiyatahu sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Right? على المحدث, upon the one in a state of ritual impurity. إذا أراد القيام للصلاة, if they seek to stand to pray. Right? القيام, right here, بمعنى الشروع. Right? 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 If they seek to stand for prayer, meaning seek to begin to pray. كما أمر الله تعالى, as Allah commanded. ولو كانت الصلاة نفلا, even if the prayer is voluntary. Right? You have to have wudu. لأن الله تعالى لا يقبل صلاة من غير طهور, because Allah Most High does not accept a prayer without purity. كما تقدم, as has come, just from a hadith of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وهو بفتح الطاء, الطهارة is with a fatha on the ta, طهور, right, in the hadith. صلاة من غير طهور. وقال بعضهم الأجود ضمه. Some said it's better there to say طهارة. Right? Right? So طهارة من غير لا يقبل الصلاة من غير طهور. Right? Right? طهور is either اسم لما يتطهر به أو الطاهر المطهر أو المطهر. Okay. وكذا لصلاة الجنازة, and likewise wudu is obligatory for صلاة الجنازة. لأنها صلاة وإن لم تكن كاملة, because the صلاة الجنازة is a salah even if it's not complete, because the salah الكاملة is ذات ركوع وسجود. A complete prayer is one that has ruku' and sujood asalatan, intrinsically. ومثلها سجدة التلاوة. Likewise, the prostration of recitation. And because as Tahtawi says, لقولهم يشترط لها ما يشترط للصلاة. The condition for سجدة التلاوة is what is a condition for the prayer. لأن للجزء حكم الكل, because the part takes the ruling of the whole. Right, and they وقد نص على على الإجماع في اشتراط الطهارة للسجدات كلها. And it's been explicitly mentioned that tahara is a condition, that there's consensus that tahara is a condition for all formal prostrations. So sajdat al-tilawa, sajdat al-shukr, etc. All of them require tahara. وكذا الوضوء فرض لمس القرآن ولو آية. Likewise, wudu is obligatory to touch the Quran, even if it be one verse. Right? And here there's a famous text from Ibn Abdul Barr, from his commentary on the Muwatta of Imam Malik. He has two great commentaries on the Muwatta. One's called At-Tamheed and the other is called Al-Istithkar. At-Tamheed is more of a hadithi commentary, and the Istithkar is more of a fiqhi commentary. Ibn Abdul Barr was a great Maliki jurist and great muhaddith. And he mentions in the Istithkar, because there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which is a letter that the Prophet ﷺ sent, that أَلَّا يَمَسَّ الْمُصْحَفِ إِلَّا طَاهِرٌ, that the Quran only be touched by someone in a state of ritual purity. And it's mentioned in the Muwatta without chain of transmission. But this was so well known, this letter was so well known, Ibn Abdul Barr elsewhere mentions, it may be in the Tamheed, I forget, that, and it could be in this, but that وَشُهْرَتُهُ تُغْنِي عَنِ الْإِسْنَادِ, that its widespread nature frees of the need for an isnad. Right? It's so widespread amongst the Salaf, number one. But number two, Ibn Abdul Barr says, أجمع فقهاء الأمصار الذين تدور حولهم وحول أصحابهم أمر الفتوى في الأمصار أن المصحف لا يمسه إلا طاهر. That the fuqaha of the lands around whom and whose companions the matter of fatwa revolves in the lands, that the mushaf can only be touched by someone in a state of ritual purity. So and then he mentions, the great early imams from across not just the four madhabs, but also many of the other great early imams, Sufyan al-Thawri and Sufyan ibn Uyayna and Layth ibn Sa'ad and Ibn Abi Layla and so many others. Anyways, of course, when he says أجمع فقهاء الأمصار, Ibn Abdul Barr's usage of ijma' is not that there's absolute scholarly consensus, but there's general agreement. Right? Because the usuli ijma' is absolute, or nearly absolute. But Ibn Abdul Barr, just important to note, he does not necessarily use ijma' in that way. But this is important. Why? Because there's people in our times who deny that. They say, well, the verse is referring to the angels. Okay? So, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. Right? It may not be touched except by those who are purified. Is that referring to the Lawh al-Mahfuz or to the Quran? Firstly, what's written in Lawh al-Mahfuz is the Quran. Number two, is described لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. What comes right after it? تنزيل من رب العالمين. What is the tanzil? What is the tanzil? It's the Quran. So even if it's referring firstly to the Lawh al-Mahfuz, and this is why literalism is so detrimental. Yeah, it's referring first, بالوضع الأول, it's referring to the angel, the Lawh al-Mahfuz. The angels do not touch it. It is only touched by the angels, but it is revealed. So that which is revealed likewise cannot be touched except in that state of tahara. Because why are we told about the angels being in a state of purity? The Quran has not come as guidance for the angels. The angels are not morally responsible. Right? Do angels lose wudu? Right? So that's why literalism sometimes has false. There he says, yes, so and so and so and so, the early Muslims said it's referring to the Lawh al-Mahfuz. Okay. Could you touch the Lawh al-Mahfuz? Like normally speaking? No. Right? And if you got there, you probably would want to be on wudu anyways, right? But, and that's where literalism sometimes, it's, because it's not just about, okay, quote this number of times. Yeah, even if it was referring to the Lawh al-Mahfuz and the angels not, but what is in the Lawh al-Mahfuz is revealed. And if the preserved tablet cannot be touched except in a state of tahara, why can it not be touched except in a state of tahara? Because it contains Quran. So when that is revealed, that which is revealed takes the same rule. It can only be touched because it contains the Quran. Because why can't the Lawh al-Mahfuz not be touched except in a state of purity, or except by those purified? Because it contains Quran. It's the word of Allah. Tanzil, and it's revealed from the Lord of the worlds. So if you want to touch the Quran, likewise the same meaning would apply. Right? And that's which is why the fuqaha quote this verse as applying to the Quran, either because the direct meaning of the verse is that you cannot touch the Quran except in a state of ritual purity, or because the implication of the verse is that you cannot touch the divine revelation except in a state of ritual purity. Okay, so it says لِمَسِّ الْقُرْآنِ وَلَوْ آيَةً, even if it be one verse. مَكْتُوبَةً عَلَى دِرْهَمْ أَوْ حَائِطٍ, such as a verse written on a coin or upon the wall. لِقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى لَا يَمَسُّهُ إِلَّا الْمُطَهَّرُونَ, it cannot be touched except those purified, from Surah Al-Waqi'ah. سواء كانت الكتابة وسواء الكتابة والبياض, and this applies both to the writing itself and the white around it. Right? وقال بعض مشايخنا. Okay, so now this is في المصحف, right? Okay. So the Quran can be written either in that which is considered mushaf or in other than that which is mushaf. So if it's written in that which is mushaf, either the full Quran or a part thereof, then none of it can be touched without tahara. سواء البياض أو الكتابة. But if it's written on something that would not be considered mushaf, like if it's written on the wall, can you not touch the whole wall? So if we put a verse of the Quran across this wall, could you not touch the wall without tahara? No. There then it only applies to the writing itself. If on a coin it says, whatever, the king of some decide to put a verse of Quran on the coin, which is not good practice, but if done, can you not touch the coin without tahara? No, you can't. You can't deliberately touch the موضع الكتابة فقط. Okay. So سواء الكتابة والبياض, this is في المصحف وما في حكمه, and in the mushaf itself or that which is considered in its ruling, like a complete, like if you sometimes they have like ربع ياسين published together, or the 30th juz printed together, or number of pages. So this would be considered like the mushaf. وقال بعض مشايخنا إنما يكره أي تحريما للمحدث مس موضع المكتوب دون الحواشي. Right? And some of our mashayikh said what's makruh, meaning tahriman, for the person in a state of ritual impurity, is touching the area of the writing, not the margins. The hawashi is the margins. لأنه لا يمس القرآن حقيقة, because touching the margins is not touching the Quran. Right? والصحيح, and the sound opinion, meaning that this other opinion is ضعيف. Right? So الصحيح أي مقابله ضعيف. Right? ضعيف لا يعمل به. Right? The other opinion is weak and not acted upon. Because say al-asah means that one مقابل الأصح قول صحيح. Right? The opposite of the more correct is an opinion that is correct in the madhab. It has some soundness. But the opposite of the sahih is a da'if. It's a weak opinion. وَالضَّعِيف لا يُعْمَل به. And the weak opinion is not acted upon. Okay. والصحيح أن مسها أي مس الحواشي, and the sound opinion is that touching it, meaning the margins, كمس المكتوب, is like touching the maktub. ولو بالفارسية, even if it be in Persian, meaning in other than Arabic. يحرم مسه اتفاقا, it is impermissible to touch it اتفاقا, by agreement of our scholars, على الصحيح, according to sound opinion. Right? So one cannot touch the translation of the Quran without wudu in the Hanafi madhab. Imam Ashrumbulali deems this to be the sahih opinion, meaning he discounts the other opinion as being weak. Others have said that there is some strength to it not being required to have wudu for the, to touch the Quran when they say Farisiya, they mean other than Arabic. But there are two opinions. The stronger opinion is that even touching a translation of the Quran requires wudu. The other opinion is either less strong or weak. Why? Because the translation contains, the Quran is النظم الدال على المعنى. It's a text that indicates the meanings. Right? But the meaning itself is ذو اعتبار. It has consideration. Because someone who hears the meaning is hearing the meaning indicated by, the primary meaning indicated by the text. So it's ذو اعتبار وذو احترام وواجب التعظيم, and it requires respect. Even though it does not have all the awsaf of the Quran, in terms of all the meanings and implications and inimitability, etc., etc. No. Right? And likewise, because that, that text is, you say that had a mushaf, it had a Quran in that sense. So that's the relied upon position. he'll mention a little more about this when he comes to after ghusl. Because he mentions what's not permitted in ghusl, without ghusl, and what's not permitted without wudu. So he goes into a little more detail there. But يعني لمس القرآن يعني ولو آية, there'll be more coming there, and we'll go into some of the ahkam of it there. So these are the two areas where in itself wudu is required, right? Prayer, even Salat al-Janaza, your number is 2 or 3. And Sajdat al-Tilawa, Mas al-Quran, 4, right? والقسم الثاني وضوء واجب, wudu that is obligatory, وهو الوضوء للطواف بالكعبة, and it is wudu for making tawaf around the Kaaba. لقوله عليه الصلاة والسلام الطواف حول الكعبة مثل الصلاة إلا أنكم تتكلمون فيه فمن تكلم فيه فلا يتكلمن إلا بخير. Right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said about the tawaf, that tawaf around the Kaaba is like prayer, except that you can talk during the tawaf. But if one of you talks during the tawaf, then talk only with the good. Then why isn't it obligatory? Right? Why isn't it obligatory? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands in the Quran regarding tawaf, وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ, and let them perform tawaf around the ancient home. So the command is a specific matter of known meaning, which is tawaf. So the command is make tawaf around the ancient home. So if you do that which is known to be tawaf, you've done what was commanded. Now I say, well, what about the way you make tawaf? It was known to the Arabs. The tawaf, the kayfiyah was known, right? Like it was inconceivable that someone would make tawaf in the opposite direction. Right? Why? Because they knew that was known. But the act of tawaf, which is going around the Kaaba, is known. The requirement was not made in the verse to be in a state of ritual purity. So al-ma'mur bihi في القرآن is مطلق الدوران حول الكعبة. It's just to go around the Kaaba. The command, and there's multiple hadiths about making tawaf in a state of ritual purity. Those hadiths, like this one which is related by Tirmidhi, are sound hadiths, but they are dhanniyu thubut. They are non-decisive. So they establish the wajib, they don't establish the fard. Because were they to establish a fard, it would, because the implication of the Quranic verse, Allah says, and make tawaf around the ancient house. If you did what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you fulfill the command. الزيادة على النص نسخ لمعناه. The Hanafi saw that adding to a text, to a clear text, is negating some of its meaning. So the implication of the verse is, if you do what I say, you fulfill my command. Right? Someone asked, bring me coffee. So I got you black coffee. Faddal. Says, but I wanted milk in it. Did you ask for milk? No. So the implication is that if you hired me to run errands for you, if you said, bring me coffee, if I brought you coffee, I did what I was told. It is a separate, right? And that's the implication of the verse. If other things were required, then they require decisive evidence. Right? So the Hanafis don't allow a dhanni text, a non-decisive text, to condition a decisive text. Rather, الافتراض إنما يثبت بالدليل القطعي ويعمل بالدليل الظني على مرتبته. And the non-decisive text is acted upon, it's not rejected, at the level that it entails. So if the dhanni text entails a command, it could establish that which is wajib, but it does not establish what is fard. That's why the tawaf is wajib, the wudu for tawaf is wajib, not fard. ولما لم يكن صلاة حقيقة لم تتوقف صحته على الطهارة. But because tawaf is not an actual prayer, so then the qiyas does not apply. The analogy between prayer and tawaf does not apply. So this is therefore it's not dependent upon tahara. فيجب بتركه دم في الواجب. So if فيجب بتركه بترك الوضوء في الطواف بتركه ترك الوضوء في الطواف by leaving wudu in طواف دم في الواجب. دم meaning slaughtering يعني an animal in the wajib. وبدنة في الفرد, and a camel if wudu is omitted in the fard. للجنابة, for janaba. وصدقة في النفل, and if omitted in the nafil, charity is due. بترك الوضوء كما ذكر في محله, as mentioned in its due place. والقسم الثالث وضوء مندوب is a recommended wudu. في أحوال كثيرة, in many situations. كمس الكتب الشرعية, such as touching religious books. ورخص مسها للمحدث, and it's a dispensation to touch them for the person in ritual impurity. Why? Because مقتضى التعظيم التزام الطهارة. Right? Because what is entailed by veneration is to hold fast to tahara in it. Why? Because what is the role of the kutub al-shar'iyya? These are bayanun لهدي الله ورسوله. This is an exposition of the command of the guidance of Allah and His Messenger. Because what is a book of fiqh? What is a book of hadith? A book of hadith is قول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو مبين قول الله تعالى. Because what is a book of hadith? It contains the guidance of the Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم, which it expounds. There is no part of the Sunnah that is not an exposition, direct or indirect, of the divine word. What is fiqh? Fiqh is al-ahkam al-tafsiliyya. It's the detailed rulings understood from Allah and His Messenger. Because usul al-shar'i thalath. Right? As Imam Nasafi mentions in the Manar, the sources of Sharia are three: al-kitab wal-sunnah wal-ijma'. The book and the sunnah and scholarly consensus. Al-ijma' la budda lahu mustanad ظاهر أو خفي من القرآن والسنة. Scholarly consensus requires a basis in the Quran and the Sunnah, explicit or implicit. Right? وَالْأَصْلُ الرَّابِعُ هُوَ الْقِيَاسِ. And the fourth foundational principle of legislation is analogy. And what is analogy? Analogy is extending a ruling from the primary texts to a specific matter that's not mentioned in the primary text, based on a shared illah, a shared legal meaning. So all of it returns to Allah and His Messenger. And likewise, the other subjects. What is tafsir? But explaining the word of Allah, etc. But the rukhsa was given lil haraj, right? ويخص مسها للمحدث إلا التفسير, except for تفسير, كذا في الدرر, except for تفسير, right? Right? So Imam al-Shurunbulali takes the position here that it's recommended to have wudu to touch the books of the Sharia, except for tafsir. He deemed it wajib to have wudu for touching the books of tafsir. لِكَثْرَةِ مَا فِيهَا مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ, because of how much they contain of the Qur'an. This is one of two opinions in the madhab. كذا في الدرر. Now, كذا في الدرر, this is what's mentioned in the Durar of Mullah Khusro. Of course, Shurunbulali has a hashia on the Durar, right? Arguably his greatest work. So he says, وهو يقتضي وجوب الوضوء لمس التفسير. And this opinion entails it being obligatory to have wudu to touch books of tafsir. فيكون من القسم الثاني. So it would be from the second category. Now he's saying كذا في الدرر, he is sort of shielding himself. He's not saying I am taking this position, right? He's ascribing it to Mullah Khusro, Sahib al-Durar. But Mullah Khusro's position is of great weight because, you know, in the late Hanafi school, Sahib al-Durar has great weight in the madhab. And the Durr al-Mukhtar of al-Haskafi relies very, very, very heavily on the Durar of Mullah Khusro. Even the title alludes to the fact that Mullah Khusro wrote this book, Ad-Durar, the many jewels. That, okay, that's got many jewels, but this is Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar. This is the chosen pearl. Even the title has an allusion to the work of Mullah Khusro. And he mentions in the Durr al-Mukhtar, Durr al-Mukhtar is the most important commentary for fatwa in the madhab. That's what Ibn Abdin wrote his hashia on, and before Ibn Abdin, but in his age, At-Tahtawi, author of the Hashia and the Maraqi, has a hashia on the Durr al-Mukhtar. Al-Haskafi says, it says, referencing everything to who said it, إلا ما كان من الدرر والغرر, except that which is from the durar and the ghurar. فلم أعزه إلا ما ندر. I didn't ascribe it to the durar of Mullah Khusro or the ghurar, which is the matan on which the durar was written, except rarely. Ibn Abdin says in his hashia, وهو يشير بذلك إلى كثرة نقله واعتماده كالمصنف في متنه وشرحه على الدرر والغرر لملا خسرو وهو حقيق بذلك فإنه كتاب مبني على غاية التحقيق. He says Al-Haskafi is pointing to his كثرة, how much he quotes from and relies upon the Durar and Ghurar of Mullah Khusro as the author, meaning At-Tumurtashi in Tanwir al-Absar does in his matan, the Tanwir, and its commentary, Minah al-Ghaffar. Then he says, وَهُوَ حَقِيقٌ بِذَلِكَ, and it's deserving it. فَإِنَّهُ كِتَابٌ مَبْنِيٌ عَلَى غَايَةِ التَّحْقِيق, because it's a book built upon the highest limits of scholarly verification. It's really important work. That notwithstanding, right? Imam al-Tahtawi rahimahullah says قوله إلا التفسير أي فلا يرخص ولو كان التفسير أكثر وهو صادق أن يكون فرضا أو واجبا لأن عدم الرخصة يجامعهما فقول المصنف وهو يقتضي إلى آخره فيه تأمل. Right? So he says that, meaning that there's what's entailed by the words of Shurunbulali is that there is no dispensation for touching tafsir without wudu. ونقل العلامة نوح أفندي عن الجوهرة والسراج. الجوهرة النيرة والسراج, which is the larger work of al-Haddadi, السراج المنير or سراج الوهاج. سراج الوهاج. Okay. Is there any manuscript of it floating around? Could you check? أن كتب التفسير لا يجوز مس موضع القرآن منها وله مس غيرها. So Allama Nuh relates that from the Jawhara and Siraj, that the books of tafsir, it's not permitted to touch the موضع القرآن منها وله أن يمس غيرها بخلاف المصحف, rather than the to the contrary of the mushaf, right? لأن جميع ذلك تبع له, because all of what's in the mushaf is considered to be related to the Quran. And right, and this is also in وكذا في الأشباه, the أشباه والنظائر of Ibn Nujaym. This is what's mentioned. راجع حاشية ibn Abdin. Is there any footnote in the Shaykh? Yeah.
Yeah, he does. So, for the Durar or the Tafsir part?
Tafsir.
So he says, ظاهره حرمة مسوك كتاب تفسير.
Does he quote Ibn Abdin?
He does.
What does he say?
He says page 119, 118,
It doesn't say.
he says إنه قال في التفسير أكثر منه في غيره وذكره فيه مقصود استقلالا لا تبعا فشبهه بالمصحف أقرب من شبهه ببقية الكتب.
But it doesn't say what Ibn Abdin has to say. Okay. Ibn Abdin quotes the Ashbah wa Nadha'ir here, and the Ashbah wa Nadha'ir mentions that the ruling of the books of tafsir is like the ruling of. So there's Quran, it's obligatory, it's to touch it in a state of wudu. Other than the Quran, it's recommended to touch it with wudu, but like the Quran, if it's written on a wall or it's written on a coin or written on anything else, let's say someone wrote Quran, which you shouldn't do, but let's say someone wrote Quran on their hijab. If they lose their wudu, do they have to take it off? Of course not. They just don't touch the place where the verse is. Of course, Quran or dhikr should not be written on clothing, etc., because one presumably wears one's clothing into the washroom, right? Or into other places where one shouldn't have the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala openly, right? If someone is wearing something like that, they should cover it up before going in, right? Even by turning it inside out, for example. So that's aqrab. So al-aqrab ila al-qawa'id, what is entailed by the principles, is that touching tafsir, it's recommended. One of the ways the ulama explain this is that those books of tafsir that are brief, that are where the mushaf would be printed in the middle, like many copies of Tafsir al-Jalalain. You have the mushaf in the middle, and you have the tafsir in the margins. Then those, the wajh of it being like a mushaf is quite clear. Right? It's mushaf with other things in the margin. So there, the tafsir would be considered tab'un lil mushaf. So those, it being wajib to touch it, only in a state of tahara, makes sense. But the larger tafsirs where the Quran is spread out amongst the text, they would take the rulings of other books. But this position is something it's recommended to act. الخروج من الخلاف مستحب. It's recommended to act in a way that takes one out of difference of opinion. Especially the Quran wajib al-ta'zim. Right? Right? And here when he says كمس الكتب الشرعية, right? الطحطاوي الطحطاوي says قال الحلواني or الحلواني إنما نلنا هذا العلم بالتعظيم فإني ما أخذت الكاغد أي الورق الأبيض إلا بطهارة. Right? It says, well, in some narrations, he's saying, Wallahi, we only acquired this knowledge through ta'zim, through veneration. He says, فَإِنِّي مَا أَخَذْتُ الْكَاغِدِ, I never touched blank paper except in a state of ritual purity. وَالسَّرَخْسِ, al-Hulwani, he's called Shamsul A'imma, right? One of the great early Hanafis. وَالسَّرَخْسِ, again, Shamsul A'imma, and he's the one who was imprisoned in a pot well because he spoke out against a local ruler. And so they had a pot well, and they would jail people in the walls of the pot well. Right? So his students would still come and visit him. So they'd be sitting on the top of the well, and they read to him the Kafi of Al-Hakim al-Shahid, whose work gathered much of the Masail of Zahir al-Riwayah. Not all of them. Right? There's discussion on how much it contains of Zahir al-Riwayah. But it's important work. And As-Sarakhsi would explain it to them from memory. He had no books with him, and most of the volumes end with a complaint that I finished such and such volume of this work while still stuck in the darkness of the well, may Allah free us from it, etc. And then he completed the work when he was released from the prison. But there's no discernible difference, and it's published in like 30 plus volumes. It has not only the position of Abu Hanifa, but of the Sahibain, the reasoning of each of them, plus the opinion of Imam Shafi'i and his reasoning and the counter reasoning of Imam Abu Hanifa, plus the derivative rulings, what the early scholars, what the scholars of the madhab say, etc., etc., etc. Right? So it's like one of the great encyclopedias of fiqh, and all of it from memory. Because that's knowledge, not just. So والسرخسي رحمه الله حصل له في ليلة داء البطن وهو يكرر درس كتابه. So one فتوضأ تلك الليلة 17 مرة. انتهى من الشرح. Imam Sarakhsi had an upset stomach one night while repeating the dars from his book. And they mentioned that it was winter and it was an intensely cold night. So he made wudu that night 17 times in order to remain on wudu while studying. Right? Okay. وَنُندِبَ الْوُضُوء لِلنَّوْمِ عَلَى طَهَارَةٍ. And it's recommended to make wudu to sleep upon tahara. Right? Right? And it's so if one makes wudu and lies down and one breaks wudu, it is recommended, one would have the reward of one's wudu, but it is superior to make wudu again in order to be asleep in a state of wudu. Right? And Imam Tahtawi mentions that. وَالنَّوْمِ عَلَى الطَّهَرَةِ وَأَيْضًا إِذَا اسْتَيْقَظَ مِنْهُ. And likewise when one wakes up from sleep. أي النوم. إذا يعني أي قرب استيقاظه منه. Right? Right? Soon after getting up. إذا استيقظ, when one wakes up, meaning قرب استيقاظه, soon after waking up. Meaning one should not, it's recommended not to unnecessarily delay making wudu after getting up from sleep. Some people get up, I'll wash my hands, let me have some breakfast, this and that, then I'll make wudu. Right? وتجديده للمداومة عليه, and to renew one's wudu, right? to remain upon wudu. Meaning that كلما نقض وضوءه كلما انتقض وضوءه يجدد وضوءه. And that whenever you break your wudu, you renew your wudu. لحديث بلال رضي الله تعالى عنه, because of the hadith of Sayyidina Bilal رضي الله تعالى عنه. Right? Because there's two principal meanings understood from the hadith of Sayyidina Bilal. One is that Sayyidina Bilal said that, because the Prophet ﷺ asked him, the hadith is mentioned by Tahtawi, that what do you do that is special, O Bilal? Because I've heard the sound of your sandals in paradise. So Sayyidina Bilal said that إني كلما أحدثت أتوضأ. Whenever I break wudu, whenever I break my wudu, I'll make wudu. وأصلي ركعتين, and I'll pray 2 rak'ahs. So there's 2 sunnahs there. One is that whenever I do break my wudu, I renew it right away, and then I pray 2 rak'ahs. Right? So there's 2, and there's many other hadiths about al-mudawama ala al-wudu. Right? Many of them are mentioned by, and it's a work that one should have and refer to, because it's easy to become lax about sunnahs like this. Allahumma salli is at-Targhib wa Tarhib of al-Mundhiri. It's an amazing gem of a book. Right. There's many hadiths about the virtues of renewing one's And of course, Tahtawi mentioned that one of the scholars was asked, will people be wearing footgear in paradise? And they said yes, because of this hadith. Right? وَلِلْوُضُوءِ عَلَى الْوُضُوءِ. Right? And also to make wudu upon wudu. Right? Because it has come that wudu upon wudu is light upon light. But there are conditions. So he says, إِذَا تَبَدَّلَ مَجْلِسُهُ. If it's a different gathering. Right? So when is it recommended to renew one's wudu? They said, either if the majlis is changed. So you made wudu and then you moved on to something else. يتبدل المجلس بتبدل المكان أو العمل, by the changing of the place or the action. Right? أو إن صلى به صلاة, or if you perform the prayer with it. Because then you went from the majlis, and that's في حكم تبدل المجلس, because you went from making wudu to the majlis of salah, and then after that, if you want to make wudu again, it's fine. Imam Ghazali though points out that as well, al-aqil yudrik taqdeem al-awla, that the intelligent person realizes that what's more important. Right? Because yes, it's recommended to make wudu, but if you're standing to pray, so you get up in the middle of the night, you made wudu, you prayed 2 rak'ahs, you want to make wudu again. Unless there's a reason to make wudu again, yes, you'll be rewarded for making the wudu, but would you be rewarded more for praying 2 rak'ahs? Yes. Unless there's a reason, right? You realize you're feeling tired. Make another wudu to refresh yourself, right? Right? And لا هذا لا يخفى. لأنه نور على نور, because it is light upon light, as is come in a hadith related from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وإذا لم يتبدل, if the majlis is not changed, so you do not do something else, or the time, enough time has not passed, فهو إسراف, then it's wastefulness. وقيد بالوضوء لأن الغسل على الغسل والتيمم على التيمم يكون عبثا, because performing ghusl upon another ghusl without need, or tayammum upon another tayammum, is abath, is a amalun bila faida, is action without purpose. right? And after sins, right? وبعد كلام غيبة يعني وبعد غيبة وكذب ونميمة وكل خطيئة, right? وبعد كلام غيبة, after speaking with غيبة, right? After speaking with backbiting, بذكرك أخاك بما يكره في غيبته, by mentioning your brother with that which he dislikes in his absence, right? Now غيبة, الطحطاوي points out that في غيبته, he says قوله في غيبته الأولى حذفه, it's better to omit this, لأنها كذلك في الحضور, right? Because غيبة also applies in his presence, right? And he mentions some of the rulings. If it's a lie, it's buhtan, right? Which is worse than غيبة, right? And it's also بكل ما يفهم منه المقصود, right? And it's also, and then he says وكما يحرم ذكرها باللسان, just as it's impermissible to utter غيبة, يحرم اعتقادها بالقلب, it's also impermissible to believe it with one's heart. It's called غيبة القلب, where you settle upon a negative opinion of another without, واستماعها, right? And it's impermissible to listen to it, right? And he mentions when ghiba is permissible, and so he does a really capable summary, and because it's important, let's look through it. وَتُبَاحُ عِنْدَ الشَّكْوَى مِنَ الظَّالِمِ لِمَنْ لَهُ قُدْرَةٌ عَلَى إِنصَافِهِ. It's permitted to make ghiba, to complain of a wrongdoer to someone who can do something about it. So at-tadhalum, just if someone is wronged, just complaining, just mentioning something bad about someone in general is not of, because can that person do anything about it? No, then that's ta'addi. وعند الاستعانة به على تغيير المنكر, and when one is seeking assistance in changing a munkar with someone who can assist you in changing it. ورد العاصي إلى الصواب, or when you seek to return a sinner to correctness. وعند الاستفتاء, and when seeking a fatwa, such as mentioning ظلمني فلان, so and so wronged me, right? But even there they say al-awla, when possible, to put it in a general way, it's better, unless it's significant to mention who it is, especially if وعند تحذير المسلمين من الشر, and when warning Muslims of evil, right? Right? And he says وكالإخبار عن العيب عند المشاورة في مصاهرة إنسان أو معاملته, or mentioning a blameworthy quality when being consulted about marrying into a family, when marrying somebody or dealing with them financially, أو المسافرة معه, or traveling with them, right? وعند ذكر فاسق بما يجاهر به لا بغيره, and to mention a blameworthy quality of a fasiq in what they publicly exhibit, not other than that. So someone who's fasiq, you can't just badmouth them about anything. And you can mention them negatively about the things that they do openly. But even then, is there a good purpose in it or not? It could be min fudul al-kalam or makruhihi, right? And he mentions a few other things, right? Right? So في غيبته, in their absence, this is a common mistake, that if I mention something negative about someone in front of them, it's not backbiting, even in Christian ethics, right? it's only called backbiting because self-respecting people wouldn't do it in front of others. Wouldn't do it in front of others. But in front of the person, right? وَكَذِب, and lying. اختلاق ما لم يكن, to make up that which wasn't, right? ولا يجوز إلا في نحو الحرب وإصلاح ذات البين وإرضاء الأهل. Right? And lying is making up that which wasn't, meaning that which is not true, right? And it's only allowed in the likes of war, right? Because the Prophet said, "Al-harbu khid'a," right? But in war, right? You should here, if you see, what's it called? Fathullah al-Mu'in of Saud. He mentions something that when it mentions that kadhib is allowed in war, right? What's meant by kadhib, lying, being allowed in war, and likewise the hadith al-harbu khid'a, that it's not al-kadhibu wal-ghishu wal-khiyana. It's not outright lying that entails cheating or deception, but rather it has the meaning of deceptive words or actions, right? It's like ta'reed, التعريض العملي, like, so you give a misimpression. So like what was done by Khalid ibn al-Walid when they had clearly fewer numbers. He spread out the enemy on a high place and they lit a lot of fires. And when they were marching, they made a lot of dust. So they thought that the numbers were much bigger, so the enemy retreated. Because they thought the Muslims got reinforcements. They didn't, they just spread out. So that's what's allowed. Even in war, khid'a is by strategy. Like the translation when you saw, war is deception. Right? Or deception in the meaning of it's stratagem. It's to outwit the enemy. And likewise, kadhib there is mahmul ala, that which gives a misimpression rather than, because ولا يدخل فيه الخيانة ونقض العهد. Cheating and breaking a covenant. So you can't make an agreement with the enemy that let's have a ceasefire and then you attack them at night. That's not what al-harbu khid'a means, right? And of course and the reason we're mentioning, some people abuse that because they take benefits and say, well, we're at war with whatever country they're talking about and we're cheating them. We said we'll come to this country and obey the laws, but we don't have to because they're at war with us. No. You gave your word, you're bound by it. And you see how the Prophet ﷺ acted after Hudaybiyah. That they'd agreed that if people come as Muslims from Mecca to Medina, what did they commit to do? While the treaty was made, to send them back. And they agreed to it. So he said, oh, that was just a treaty. No, they sent them back and told them to be patient, right? So anyways, في الحرب وإصلاح ذات البين, and to mend relations, right? وإرضاء الأهل, and to make one's family happy. بعد غيبة وكذب ونميمة, and tale bearing. النمام المضرب والنميمة السعاية بنقل الحديث من قوم إلى قوم على جهة الإفساد. Right? Tale bearing is to go between people by relating things from one group of people to another in a manner that harms relationships. أو هو إفشاء السر, or it's to disclose that which is secret, which is anything that another would not want to be disclosed. Right? وَبَعْدَ كُلِّ خَطِيئَةٍ, and after every sin. Right? So, and Tahtawi mentions, وَمِنْهَا الشَّتِيمَةِ, after insulting somebody. وَالنِّفَاقِ, and this is النِّفَاقُ الْقَوْلِ, when after hypocritical words. Someone asks you, did you do it? Say, yeah, I did it, but you didn't. So it's a sin. Right? وَالتَّمَلُّقُ and then he explains out. Right? Or النفاق يعني by just not acting on and وإنشاد شعر, and after reciting poetry يعني and he conditioned it in the commentary, إنشاد شعر قبيح, impermissible poetry. لأن الوضوء يكفر الذنوب الصغائر, because wudu expiates for small sins, as is come in the hadith of Sayyidina Uthman and others. وقهقهة خارج الصلاة, and laughing out loud outside the prayer. لأن حدث سورة, because it's like it has the form of a breaking of ritual purity. إذا كانت على وجه الغفلة أو الإكثار, if it's done out of heedlessness or excessiveness. Heedlessness, laughing at sinful things and so on, or excessively. Right? كثرة الضحك من غير ذكر الله تميت القلب. Excessive laughter, which is that which is done with respect to sinful things or extensively, heedlessly. وغسل ميت وحمله, and likewise after washing the dead or carrying them. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من غسل ميتا فليغتسل ومن حمله فليتوضأ. Whoever washes the dead, let them perform ghusl, and whoever carries them, let them make wudu. Right? And there's an issue here, because it would indicate that it's recommended to make ghusl after washing the deceased, and this Tahtawi says that this is what actually is explicitly mentioned by al-Halabi in Sharh al-Munya al-Kabir, as mentioned by al-Sayyid. Al-Sayyid is the same, Sayyid Abu Saud al-Masri al-Azhari. And some understood that this is, some said, whoever washes the deceased, let them فليغتسل, let them wash up. الغسل بالمعنى اللغوي. Right? So at least wash your hands. Wudu, and wudu is recommended. Right? So broadly, the ulama, with rare exceptions, deemed it to be this not to be for obligation but for encouragement. Right? So some said what is recommended after ghusl is ghusl. After ghusl of the dead is to take a bath. Others said no, what's meant by ghusl here in the hadith is to wash your hands, because you're just dealing with the dead. It's like من مس ذكره فليتوضأ, whoever touches their private parts, let them make wudu. Meaning بالمعنى اللغوي, in the lexical meaning of wudu, which is to wash. What do you wash? Your hands. Right? Or فليغتسل, let them wash up, meaning the shari'i washing, which is wudu. Wallahu a'lam. But it would be superior here to make ghusl, but out of recommendation, not obligation. وَلِوَقْتِ كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ, and for the time of each prayer, it's recommended to make wudu. لأنه أكمل لشأنها, because it is more complete, and it used to be obligatory. وقبل غسل الجنابة, and before ghusl from janaba, as we've taken, as we'll be taking, that from the sunnahs of ghusl for janaba is wudu before the ghusl. Right? It's recommended, rather it's a sunnah mu'akkada. Right? Right? But it's mu'akkad, right? It's a sunnah mu'akkada. That's often ignored. لورود السنة به, because the sunnah has mentioned it. وللجنب, and it's recommended for the junub عند إرادة أكل وشرب ونوم, and for the junub when they seek to eat, drink, or sleep, to make wudu. Right? And there's difference of opinion, right? That here is what is meant is the wudu al-shar'i, which is to make a full wudu, or washing the hands. Right? Imam Tahtawi says wudu between two separate acts of intercourse and before sleep, the shar'i wudu is mentioned, like the full wudu. Right? And this is mentioned by Imam al-Aini in Sharh al-Bukhari. Right? And he mentions the hadith regarding it. Right? Because mentioned, let them make wudu for the prayer. Right? And then after some lines he says, أما الوضوء عند إرادة أكل أو شرب. Says, as for wudu, so Tahtawi says, as for wudu, when being in a state of janaba, before eating or drinking, فالمراد به اللغوي. What's meant by wudu there is the general lexical meaning of wudu, which is غسل اليدين, because of what's mentioned by al-Tahawi and Abu Dawood and Ibn Majah from Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا أراد أن يأكل وهو جنوب غسل يديه. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, if he wanted to eat when he was in a state of ritual impurity, he would wash his hands. Right? قال في شرح المشكاة وعليه جمهور العلماء. This is the position of the majority of the scholars. The Sharh of Mishkah, the most famous one is of Mullah Ali al-Qari. Right? There's many great shuruh on Mishkat al-Masabih. Mishkat al-Masabih is by al-Tabrizi. Great commentaries were written on it. So Mishkat al-Masabih is one of the works that any talib ilm should have. It used to be taught, it remains taught. It's been taught since the author wrote it, at-Tabrizi. And Mishkat al-Masabih is important because the origin of the book is a book called Masabih al-Sunnah. And Masabih al-Sunnah by al-Baghawi, he gathered the hadiths of the Kutub al-Sitta and some hadiths from outside the Kutub al-Sitta. But the author of Masabih al-Sunnah didn't arrange them. So he arranged it between what is Sahih and what is Hasan. But he doesn't actually reference the hadiths back to their books. But it's a beautiful work because it gathers within it the hadith of the Kutub al-Sitta, omitting the repeated hadiths and the hadiths with similar wording. Which is very useful. And the Masabih al-Sunnah has many commentaries upon it. Amongst them, very significantly, and it's published now, although God knows how the Arab world works. The Kuwaitis published the Sharh of Ibn Malak, Sharh al-Masabih of Ibn Malak, one of the great Hanafis, but they published it only for free distribution, so you can't get it. Well, I'm going to try to make an attempt to get 6 copies. Let's see how it goes. So you cannot buy the book. So you edit the book in 6 volumes and nobody can receive it. Right? Thank God it's online. It's a brief commentary. But so at-Tabrizi took Masabih al-Sunnah and he referenced all the hadiths back to, and he arranged each chapter. Al-Baghawi had just divided between al-Sihah and al-Hisan, Sahih Hadith and sound Hadith. And he's a bit expansive in his usage of both terms. So what At-Tabrizi did, he took Masabih al-Sunnah and he arranged each chapter into 3 parts. What has come in Bukhari and or Muslim, then what's come in the remaining 4 books of the Kutub al-Sittah, and third part, what's come in other than the Kutub al-Sittah. So it's very nicely arranged, while giving a brief referencing for each hadith that's related by Abu Dawood and Ibn Majah. So make it much more usable. And this is such a great khidmah that At-Tabrizi's own teacher, Allama At-Tibi, wrote a commentary on it. And it's one of the rare books in Islamic history where the teacher commented on the student's book. Very rare. And At-Tibi's commentary is brilliant. At-Tibi was a great, great imam. And from the time of At-Tibi, of At-Tabrizi, Mishkat al-Masabih was taught. So there are numerous commentaries on it. Great, great scholars. So amongst them, At-Tibi and At-Turbashti and many others wrote commentaries upon it. Al-Madhari or Al-Mudhiri. Arguably the most important are, if you had one commentary on Mishkat al-Masabih, it should be Mulla Ali al-Qari, especially for a Hanafi. But overall, it's arguably the most brilliant of the commentaries on Mishkat al-Masabih. But the At-Tibi is very significant as well. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. And one of the great hadith imams of the Indian subcontinent, Shah Abdul Haq al-Muhaddith al-Dahlawi, wrote Lama'at al-Tanqih fi Sharh Mishkat al-Masabih, and that's published as well, one of these editions that were published by one of these Wizarat of Awqaf in a very fancy edition, but very difficult to find. And that's a great commentary on the Mishkat. And Imam Muhammad Idris al-Kandahlawi wrote At-Ta'liq al-Sabih, which is brilliant. And there's a modern edition of that. So there's a number of modern commentaries. So the number of commentaries, and there's numerous commentaries in Urdu because it remains taught in the madaris of the Indian subcontinent. Amongst them, amongst the many, is Madahir al-Haq in Urdu, Madahir al-Haq, and Mullah Salimullah Khan, one of the great Pakistani scholars who passed away a few years ago, he wrote a commentary on it. So there's many, many commentaries, but Mullah Ali al-Qari's is arguably the most important. And generally, especially in Hanafi books, if Sharh al-Mishkat is mentioned, the assumption would be it's Mullah Ali al-Qari. So anyways, right? So what's recommended for, between intercourse and eating, and between sleep and between intercourse and sleep, is the Shar'i wudu. But it's recommended, it's not required. So Tahtawi quotes the Khaniya, Fatawa Qadi Khan, that the Junub, إذا أراد أن يأكل المستحب له أن يغسل يديه. The person in Janaba, if they want to eat, it's recommended for them to wash their hands and their mouth. But if they don't do it, وإن ترك فلا بأس به. There's nothing wrong with it. Right? And it's mentioned in خزانة الأكمل وإن ترك لا يضره. If they leave it, it won't harm them. Meaning that they're leaving, it's recommended but not blameworthy not to do it. Right? Right? And then he says, وَمُعَوَدَةِ وَطْءٍ, and if one returns to intercourse, right, then it's recommended to make wudu, not required but recommended. وَلِغَضَبٍ, and for out of anger.
يعني because the words of the Prophet ﷺ إن الغضب من الشيطان والشيطان خلق من النار وإنما يطفأ النار بالماء فإذا غضب أحدكم فليتوضأ. That fire is from the shaitan, anger is from the shaitan, and the shaitan was created from the fire. So if one of you, and fire is only extinguished by water, so if one of you is angered, then make wudu. And it's related by Ahmad and Abu Dawud and others. Right? Right? And this is even if one already has wudu. And then Tahtawi says, فَإِنِ اشْتَدَّ الْغَضَبْ نُدِبَ لَهُ الْغُسْلِ. And if one's anger becomes intense, it's recommended to make ghusl. لأنه, so getting back to Tahtawi, to Shurmulay says, لأنه يطفئه, because it, meaning wudu, الوضوء يطفئ الغضب. ولقراءة القرآن, it's recommended to make wudu for recitation of the Quran. Touching the Quran when not in wudu it's obligatory to make wudu to touch the Quran if not in wudu. But if wants to merely recite the Quran when not in wudu, دون مس, it is recommended. Likewise, وقراءة hadith, and likewise to recite hadith. Right? And likewise for the ulum al-shar'iyya, right? وروايته, to transmit hadith. تعظيما لشرفهما, out of veneration for the nobility of Quran and hadith. ودراسة علم, and to study knowledge, meaning shar'i. وأذان وإقامة وخطبة, and likewise for the adhan, iqama and khutbah. ولو خطبة نكاح, and even if it is the khutbah of nikah. وزيارة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, and to visit the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. تعظيما لحضرته ودخول مسجده, out of veneration of his presence and to enter his mosque. ووقوف بعرفة, and for the standing of at Arafah. لشرف المكان, because of the nobility of the place. ومباهاة الله تعالى الملائكة بالواقفين بها, because Allah, He takes pride in those who are standing there before the angels. وَلِلسَّعِي بَيْنَ الصَّفَا وَالْمَرْوَةِ, and to do the sa'i between Safa and Marwa. لِأَدَاءِ الْعِبَادَةِ, to fulfill the act of worship على أكمل وجه, in the more complete way. وشرف المكان, because of the nobility of the two places, Safa and Marwa. وبعد أكل لحم جزور, and after eating camel meat, because of the اختلاف about it. للقول بالوضوء منه خروجا من الخلاف, because of the opinion that is required to make wudu from it in order to avoid the difference of opinion. Right? And it's an opinion ascribed to Imam Ahmad. Because there are Sahaba who are eating from camel meat, but there's many other things taking place in the hadith. So there's difference of opinion. Was it done because they were in a state of heedlessness, they're laughing out loud, etc.? Or is it abrogated, or does it apply? Only a very minority position exists of it being a command of general obligation to make wudu from eating camel meat. So there's no, and the Hanafis, you see, there's no, the illah of wudu is not realized, which we'll be looking at next week, of what is the legal cause of wudu. للقول بالوضوء, because of the opinion that wudu is required from it. خروجا من الخلاف, and to avoid the difference of opinion, right? And the ruling of الخروج من الخلاف مستحب, right? من الخلاف مستحب ما لم يترتب عليه ارتكاب ارتكاب مكروه في مذهبه. Avoiding difference of opinion is recommended as long as it does not entail doing something that would be makruh in one's own madhab. ولو ولو كان مكروها كراهة تنزيه, even if it's somewhat disliked. And of course, وما لم يكن الخلاف ضعيفا جدا. And as long as the difference of opinion is not excessively weak, right? Because there are, who is it? Imam Suyuti says in some lines of poetry that ليس كل خلاف معتبر إلا خلافا له حظ من النظر. Not every difference of opinion is of consideration, rather only those opinions that have some share of sound judgment, right? So so for example, Imam al-Juwayni says that خلاف الظاهرية لا يلتفت إليه. The difference of opinion of the literalists is not of consideration, right? Because the literalists sometimes said things that go against basic principles of sound textual understanding, let alone interpretation. So for example, Imam Ibn Hazm said that if a woman is married, if her hayd finishes, it's obligatory to have intercourse immediately. Because Allah فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَا مِنْ حَيْثُ أَمَرَكُمْ. Once they're in a state of ritual purity, then approach them as Allah has commanded you. The command there, according to all the other schools, is of permission. That after the manner, now it is permitted for you to approach them. But he says there's 4 reasons why approaching them is obligatory. And you cannot delay it unreasonably. That's not a difference of opinion to avoid, because it goes against. But for those, al-marji' fihi al-ulama, is the ulama. What? And the asl is any khilaf within the 4 madhabs is of consideration. Right? They relied upon position of the 4 madhabs, opinions accepted within the madhab as having some basis. Right? And that's why the ulama mentioned, the difference of opinion, one avoids them after learning one's basics, right? There's a method. One first learns one's madhab to get to do the obligatory and leave the haram, then to do the sunnah and leave the makruh, right? Across the chapters of fiqh. Once one has done that and is taking care also of, the state of one's inward, then as a next step in one's mujahada, one learns another madhab to avoid the difference of opinion of that madhab. And then say that's mujahadatul fuqaha, the way of spiritual striving of the fuqaha. But as one learns, when one learns about difference of opinion, as one learns, then one does one's best to avoid the difference of opinion there. So for example, if one touched one's spouse, right? So they mention explicitly in some books, للخروج من خلاف العلماء, as he mentions, right? وَلِذَا عَمَّمَهُ فَقَالْ وَلِلْخُرُوجِ مِنْ خِلَافِ سَائِرِ الْعُلَمَاء, and to avoid the difference of all the scholars, كَمَا إِذَا مَسَّ امْرَأَةً, such as if one touched a woman, we would defend vigorously that أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاء, if you touch women, lams there is understood clearly to refer to intercourse. But, so we would defend that position, well, the Hanafis would, but in terms of action, we avoid the difference of opinion. Right? Because in matters of fiqh, the ulama believe our opinion is sound with the possibility of error. And the opinion of the other schools is not sound with the possibility of being sound. So caution entails the recommendation of avoiding their difference. And that's the respect that's inherent in the mainstream of Islamic scholarship. And the fairness. كما إذا مس امرأة أو فرجه ببطن كفه, or if one touches one's private parts with the inner palm of one's hand. لتكون عبادته صحيحة بالاتفاق. In order for one's act of worship to be valid by agreement. Right? بالاتفاق عليها استبراء لدينه. In order to seek to استبراء, to fully clear one's debt to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. هكذا جمعت. Such were the places where it's recommended to make wudu gathered. Right? وإنما ذكر بعضها بصفة السنة في محله للفائدة التامة بتوفيق الله تعالى. And even though some of them were mentioned as being sunnah in their due place, in order to complete the فائدة بتوفيق الله تعالى وكرمه, by the facilitation of Allah and His generosity. Right? So he gathered so many places where it's recommended to make wudu. Right? And Imam al-Hasqafi added some places. He gathered even more than this in his larger sharh on Tanwir al-Absar. He mentioned some of them in the Durr al-Mukhtar, but most of them go back to these principles, right? So I remember in the class we're reading with Shaykh Hassan, and one of the places that's recommended is وَالنَّظَرِ إِلَى مَحَاسِنِ امْرَأَةٍ. So one of the people, because sometimes in class we'll lose this context. So one of the younger mashayikh, and respected, she said, "Sidna, هذا قبل النظر أم بعده?" And everyone said, "Is it before looking or after?" And then everyone broke down. He said, "That's it," because you're just thinking legally, not practically. Because one of the times when it's recommended to make wudu is after looking at the beauty of a woman. You need another. You just like you could see. He said, "Sidna, is it before or after?" Because he didn't say wa'inda. It maybe said in I forget the exact expression. Everyone broke down that. Right? And the answer, of course, is obvious. And look here, because he gathered something that, as much of this, it's not been gathered in this comprehensive way in most other books. He says, بِتَوْفِيقِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى وَكَرَمِهِ, by the facilitating grace of Allah and His generosity. مَنْ وَجَدَ خَيْرًا فَلْيَحْمِدِ اللَّهِ. He's also pointing that what I have gathered here is much more detailed than what you can find in most other books. So this is a clear fa'idah. Then he says, فَصْلٌ يَنْقُضُ الْوُضُوءَ 12 شَيْئًا. Wudu is invalidated by 12 things, all of which go back to one meaning, which is خُرُوجُ النَّجَاسَةِ. Right? Is the exiting of filth. حَقِيقَةً وَحُكْمًا, actually or effectively. And we will see why that is the invalidator of wudu, and what's the basis of it, and how that excludes other things that have come in the sunnah that outwardly would appear to require wudu. بإذن الله تعالى. And since you're going on base camp, actually just make me a task, you today, to share. We'll share a few hadiths from the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad about wudu when touching one's private parts, why it's not required. And it's a useful discussion, right? Just to appreciate some of the hadith of ahkam. So we'll share that and just touch on it briefly. And the things that invalidate wudu, we'll look at these. بإذن الله تعالى. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. But we are definitely accelerating in the pace of reading, so do keep ahead in your preparations.